very quickly, something that I've learned from a single source. You're a lawyer. I'm told that there are a lot of former transition team members in and outside of the White House now purging their private phones, afraid that they're going to get subpoenaed by these various investigators. What is their legal risk for purging their phones of any transition comments?
You know, I'm not sure. If you've been subpoenaed to preserve those messages, then you'd be violating the law. So I'm not sure. I'm not privy to what.
What if you've gotten a letter from the White House counsel or someone else telling you
that told you to preserve? Then there might be some legal ramifications.
Andrea Mitchell reporting today on MSNBC with careful sourcing. She's citing one source saying that White House officials are now purging their phones in anticipation that they are going to be subpoenaed. They would, of course, be in legal jeopardy if they are doing that after they've been advised that they need to preserve any communications. In fact, on March 1st, the Associated Press reported that the White House counsel notified White House staffers that they must preserve electronic communications pursuant to any investigation. So if they've been told to preserve and they're purging this stuff, all of them who are doing that, all of you who are doing that, if you're watching me, you are potentially in legal jeopardy for doing that. That's in the White House. And if you have any doubts about the scope of the investigation, whether it's the one in Congress, or the one being carried out by the FBI, or the ones being carried out, honestly, by the Fourth Estate, as every investigative reporter in the country starts pulling on this forest of loose threads that is hanging off the White House denials in this story, you need look no further today than the tiny island nation of Cyprus. Cyprus is a notorious banking hub for criminal Russian money laundering. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel was reporting from Cyprus today on the financial trails of the Russian government and the Russian oligarchs and the question of whether any of those trails lead to the president or his campaign. The AP is now reporting that there is a serious American financial crime investigation that has followed to Cyprus the financial trail of Trump's Russia-linked campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. And I actually have a few things that we can report on that front tonight, which have either been swamped in today's news or otherwise not previously reported. It's fascinating stuff. It's all bad news for the administration. A few points here. First, we can report tonight that the Attorney General of Cyprus says that that country's government has now handed over to U.S. investigators information about Paul Manafort's financial transactions in Cyprus. Again, Cyprus, best known in the financial world as the largest international hub for laundering dirty Russian money. That government is cooperating with U.S. investigators and handed over documentation of Paul Manafort's financial transactions in that company. That's one. Two, we can also report tonight that New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, who has taken a particular interest in the money laundering part of this investigation and this conundrum, New Jersey Senator Cory Booker has demanded an explanation from the newly confirmed Trump administration Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross about his role in the notoriously corrupt Bank of Cyprus, where he's a major shareholder and until recently was vice chairman. Senator Booker gave Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, until today to explain his connections, through that bank or otherwise, to another major Bank of Cyprus shareholder who also happens to be the Russian oligarch who did this otherwise inexplicable real estate transaction with Donald Trump in Palm Beach a few years ago, which netted President Trump over $50 million in profit. The deadline for Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross to respond to the senator's inquiry about that was today. We can further report tonight that the Commerce Secretary has given no response to that letter. We can also report, and this is definitely new, this has not been reported elsewhere, and this is potentially a big deal. We can report exclusively tonight that there is more turmoil beneath the surface when it comes to another criminal investigation of another bank that has been implicated in multi-billion-dollar Russian money laundering, a bank that also happens to be the single largest lender of any kind to Donald Trump himself. Of course, we haven't seen much of his tax returns, but from the president's own financial disclosures, it appears that he owes more than $300 million to a bank called Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank appears to be his single largest lender. The Justice Department is currently prosecuting Deutsche Bank over currency trading practices and their role in the mortgage crisis and the financial collapse in this country, and also Russian money laundering. We can now report that Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland is writing to Attorney General Jeff Sessions, urging the Attorney General that he needs to recuse himself from overseeing that at the Department of Justice. If there is going to be a Deutsche Bank prosecution, if there are going to be settlement negotiations with Deutsche Bank, particularly over the issue of Russian money laundering, Senator Sessions should recuse. That case is being made now by Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen. He's also demanding to know from the Attorney General, demanding to know from Jeff Sessions and the Justice Department, quote, were any investigations of Deutsche Bank a factor when President Trump decided to fire former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara after initially telling him he could continue in his position during this administration? All of those cases against Deutsche Bank, all of those cases against the major lender to Donald Trump, including the Russian money laundering one, they are all being run out of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Now that they fired Preet Bharara as the head of that office, the lack of a U.S. attorney there means that technically Attorney General Jeff Sessions is in charge of all those investigations now. Can he do that fairly? This letter from Senator Van Hollen represents the first shot across the bow from Democrats, telling the Attorney General, basically, don't interfere. Literally, get yourself out of the way of these independent criminal investigations, which may conceivably touch not just the Russian money laundering side of this, but conceivably the president's finances as well, since he is so personally tied up in that bank to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay? And into the middle of that omelet today, the Wall Street Journal cracked this new egg today. This is absolutely bonkers. That's a technical term, sorry. Former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, he's a neoconservative, hawkish intelligence guy. He's emerged as a real hawk, not just over things like the Iraq War, but over lots of different international conflicts over the years. He served under 4 different presidents, including as CIA director under President Clinton. He was a senior advisor to the Trump campaign, both during the campaign and into the transition. There was, you might remember, a weird flurry of sort of speculation and concern when former CIA Director Jim Woolsey suddenly quit the Trump transition effort, effective immediately in the first week of January. Nobody quite knew why. Well, now, today, he has told the Wall Street Journal a truly bizarre story about Mr. Loose End himself, former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. Jim Woolsey now tells the Wall Street Journal that 1 week after he joined the Trump campaign, on September 19th of last year, he was invited to a meeting at a New York hotel called the Essex House. When he got to the Essex House, he was greeted there for that meeting by Michael Flynn, also by the Foreign Minister of Turkey, and also by the son-in-law of the Turkish dictator, who also happens to be that country's energy minister. That's how these things tend to go in countries like that, Ivanka. Jim Woolsey, former CIA director, now tells the Wall Street Journal today that what that meeting was about, what was discussed at that meeting in September, was a plan to basically kidnap a guy. There is an exiled Turkish cleric who has a green card to live in the United States. He's a legal permanent resident of this country. He lives in Pennsylvania in the Poconos. The Turkish government is fixated on him and blames him for the coup they had to deal with last summer, blames him basically for all unrest and all bad things in that country. They have been desperate to have the United States extradite him back to Turkey so they can draw and quarter him, put him on trial for his alleged treason in Turkey. Well, we now know, because Mike Flynn retroactively registered as an agent for a foreign power earlier this month, we now know that while he was the senior advisor on national security matters to the Trump campaign, and during the Trump transition, we now know that Michael Flynn was being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to work for the Turkish government at that time. And according to former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, who says he was in the room for it, one of the things Mike Flynn was apparently doing for that contract, for that money, was convening this meeting in New York in September, where they talked about basically pulling off a kidnapping to get around these pesky U.S. extradition laws and subvert the U.S. government and spirit this guy off to Turkey in the dead of night. Quote from the Wall Street Journal, quote, Mr. Woolsey said the idea was a covert step in the dead of night to whisk this guy away. You know, it was weird and abrupt and unexplained when Jim Woolsey quit the Trump transition in January. He implies to the Wall Street Journal in this story today that he is telling the story about Mike Flynn now because he was very disturbed by this meeting at the time when he went to it back in September. But if he was disturbed by it on September 19th, why did he stay on the Trump campaign and then on the Trump transition until January? And what has changed in his thinking about Mike Flynn and what might come to be known about this period in American politics that has suddenly made him decide to come forward now and declare himself to have not been part of that whole kidnapping discussion at all? We asked Director Woolsey to please come on this show tonight to discuss with us what happened there exactly, whether it was Mike Flynn's kidnapping plan that was being discussed or whether it was the Turkish government's kidnapping plan and Mike Flynn was helping them work out the details or maybe even trying to talk them out of it. I would love to also hear what led to Director Woolsey's change of heart, that this is a matter that should now be put out in the open after he sat on it for 6 months and said nothing about it before today. There is a counterintelligence investigation at the FBI. There are congressional investigations that have already led to bombshell revelations despite the White House, those investigations having White House-friendly leadership. There's an obvious effort now by the chairman of one of those investigations to throw it off the rails, or to at least stop that investigation from doing anything that can be seen in public anymore. There is, we now know, a far-reaching international financial investigation that has resulted already in the transmittal of financial records by Trump campaign senior officials. They have transmitted those records from known Russian money laundering hubs to investigators in the United States. There are other far-reaching criminal financial investigations that touch on both Russian money laundering and the president's leading lender. And in those cases, those investigations are already in the hands of U.S. attorneys. They are already that far along. And the White House is pretending they've never heard of the president's former campaign chairman, whose financial transactions have just been sent to U.S. investigators from Cyprus. The president's former campaign chairman is now volunteering to testify. No one has seen hide nor hair of Michael Flynn. Nobody knows whether he will testify or where. We've got direct evidence, actually, and weird evidence we're going to get to later on this hour, that the White House may be trying to blame the whole thing on Michael Flynn. That might be convenient for the White House. I doubt Michael Flynn would think it's convenient for him. That creates a very interesting dynamic about his potential role as a witness. This is like the Hunger Games part of the Trump administration. And we're less than 70 days in. Hasn't even been 10 weeks. We've already got senior people being held out as sacrifices and other people clearly moving to protect themselves. If Andrea's reporting is correct about White House officials purging their White House devices because they're all expecting subpoenas, A, those people may be in legal jeopardy, but B, let's just suffice to say this is not the best of times for the administration. This is not what a honeymoon looks like. This is a dire period of scandal that you would put up against any modern presidency at any time in any scandal. And yet there has been this effort in Washington all along this week to kind of carry on as if this is normal and this is a normal week. Yeah, we're considering our Supreme Court nominee. Why not? We're moving forward on our campaign promise to take health insurance away from 24 million Americans. Why not? Our big health care plan that is approved of by 17% of the American people. And if you ask them who strongly approves of the plan, the number drops to 6%. Before the administration started, the day after Election Day, there was no question that the Republicans would be able to kill Obamacare. They'd be able to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That was like the low-hanging fruit. That was the obvious thing they could do with only Republican votes. Yeah, sure, they only have a 2-seat majority in the Senate, but they've got a 44-seat majority in the House. Some other things might be hard for them, but repealing Obamacare, no problemo. That's how it looked before these guys actually got in there. But then these guys actually got in there. And it turns out they are operating from a position that is not just profoundly weak and unpopular, it's a catastrophe. Yeah, and they blew it and completely belly-flopped and humiliated themselves on their biggest legislative priority, which they've been prepping for and bragging about and promising for 7 straight years. What is even more amazing than that, though, is that right now is the least of their problems. Senator Chuck Schumer, top Democrat in the Senate, is here tonight to give us his reaction to this, to tell us what to expect next from the Democrats.
Stay with us.